Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of ProView. Welcome, Amit.
Thank you, Mon sir. Uh, so, what's this agenda today?
Today, we are really proud to host one of the most respected photographer from Bangalore, a senior photographer and a senior surgeon working for Columbia Asia. I respect him a lot for his work. And please welcome Dr. Ajit Huilgol.
Welcome, doctor.
Doctor, we are really proud that you are here with us. It's a privilege for us to host you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's wonderful. I've been following this program for some time now, and I was really enamored by it. And since Mohan, very, very close friend of mine, and of course, I've heard about Amit and seen some of his images on INW a number of years ago when we were all very active on that.
Yes.
But Mohan, I've known well for some time, and we've interacted in various places, but we've never interacted like this, as you know, as host and guest. So really, really proud to be on this program, and would like to share my experiences with all of you. Really love it.
So, doc. So, guys, for those who wanted to see Dr. Ajit's images, you won't find it anywhere on Instagram, no Facebook, no Twitter. Okay.
Unfortunately, yes.
IW, you few privileged people, we were actually present during those days, 2007, 8 on INW, and that's why I know Dr. Ajit. He's a very senior kidney transplant surgeon, very busy, and that's why I wanted to ask you, Dr. Ajit. I mean, how this photography thing has started?
No, one needs to go back a long, long way. For that, I agree with Dr. Ullas Karant when he says that when you're born as a baby, you are, you have nature and wildlife as in your DNA.
Mhm.
You're born with that interest. In front of a small baby, if you place biscuits in the shape of, round like Marie biscuit, or rectangle like your barley glucose, or biscuits in the shape of animals and birds, the child will reach for that first, for the animals and birds,
Sure.
because of that inherent love for nature that we have. And we carry that with us right through our lives. What happens is, after a few years, the first 4 or 5 years, we start going to school. We are sent to school actually. And then, I beg your pardon, but no, we are taught all sorts of nonsense, including arithmetic and history and geography and algebra and worse, trigonometry and calculus and stuff like that. And this gets pushed to the background.
Sure.
All that it needs is a little, that thing is, embers are still burning.
Mhm.
It requires something to sort of rekindle it. And I was fortunate that that never really went down. I was always reading books on wildlife and so on. Couldn't afford to buy a camera until I was almost 40 years old, because I was working in a medical college. And after 10 years in a medical college and being a professor and head of two departments, my take home salary was 3,700 rupees a month, 5,100 total at the age of 40. I was heading two departments, mind you. This was in MS Ramaya Medical College after 10 years of teaching there. That's when I decided to go into private, and I bought my first camera then. So that's how, from interest in wildlife that was always there
Mhm.
to progressing to a camera.
Yeah. In fact, guys, for those who are watching, first of all, thank you so much for all your love, likes, feedbacks. We are trying to improve on this, and based on your feedback, guys, we are venturing into different topics, different locations, and today this episode is so special because that one place where I wish to go in the near future, Dr. Ajit is taking us over there. And believe me, guys, this one place has, in terms of knowledge or in terms of information on social media, you won't find much on it. So, guys, I'm going to hand over the session to Dr. Ajit, and Dr. Ajit is going to take us on a journey to extreme south of this earth, and that's called Antarctica. So, Dr. Ajit is all yours. Please share your journey to Antarctica.
Okay, thank you. Antarctica, I mean, a place that will send sort of goosebumps through you, especially if you think, you're going to be going there, or you meet a person who's been there and is talking about first, time experiences from that place. It's absolutely wonderful. And since I was very young, I was interested in wildlife. But in 2007, I bought my first digital camera.
Mhm.
By 2008, I had enough images to get the associateship of the Royal Photographic Society. So once I got those 4 letters after my name, all the other MBBS and the MS and the MNA, MS and all the other things, I forgot all that. That's the reason why you see only these 4 letters after my name, because that hardly matters now. I mean, I'm not going to be branding myself as a surgeon, especially not to a photography group anyway. So ARPS, and I wear that badge very, very proudly. That was in 2008. 2009, one of my images won the runner-up award in the BBC Wildlife Photographer of the Year in the mammals behavior category.
Wow.
And that was in 2009, so just 2 years later. And by 2010, I had started making a wish list. Nowadays, people call it bucket list. I mean, it's a terrible term. Places that you need to see before you kick the bucket. So, no, I don't like that. I'll go to the old term, which is a wish list. And on that wish list, I had a number of places. Kenya, Tanzania, usual. Botswana, and Namibia, and the Arctic, the Antarctic, the Amazon, Pantanal, all the others that people keep thinking about. I'm talking about. But Antarctica was right up there on top.
Mhm.
And the reason why I wanted to do that first was for several reasons. One, the remoteness of the place. It is probably the farthest from where we are in India. You can't go to a place which is further than that.
Sure.
Second, the cost that was involved. That was okay, partly. The third was, taking one whole month off. I went from November 1st to December 1st, one whole month away from work, and I'm in private practice. When you're in private practice, you're like an auto rickshaw driver. If someone hires you, you get paid. If nobody hires you, you don't get paid. So it's not like in a job where you have a regular salary. So I had to take 1 month off and tell my patients. Luckily for me, I'm a kidney transplant surgeon, so my patients can stay alive on dialysis. It's not like other surgeries. So I tell them, please stay alive. I'm going to come back in 1 month's time, and then do the surgery. So that for several reasons, and the cold, the extreme weather, the slippery conditions, the rain, the snow, and literally all the hardships that one can imagine. And to go through that when I was much younger, I'm 69 plus now. So that was 7 years ago. So I thought I'd get that out of my way first of all. So I thought I'll do that first and then think of all the other things which would, in relation, be a walk in the park, Arctic and so on. So I did that the first of all. And whenever I have given this talk, people usually ask me 2 or 3 questions. And the first question they ask is, why did you go in November when it is so cold? Why not go in summer? Then you have to keep telling them, look, this is the southern hemisphere. November, December are the warmest months, relatively speaking. November, December, and January. Because when I say relative, because when we landed there, the maximum temperature was 0 and the minimum temperature was -2. When we came back after 1 whole month on December 1st, it was snowing in that place where we boarded the ship. So, like I said, it's relatively speaking, but it can get much, much colder in winter. And obviously, you can't even travel. There is lots of ice, and even the ships can't go through. So that is the time that I had to go.
Right.
Second question people ask is, how many polar bears did you see? And I say, fortunately, God made sure that there are no polar bears in the southern hemisphere, because most of the creatures there cannot fly. The penguins can't fly. So many other birds can't fly as well. So these polar bears would have had a whale of a time. They would have slaughtered all the penguins that they had been there. So God was, in his wisdom, placed the polar bears in the North Pole and all the penguins in the South Pole. So no polar bears, unfortunately. For those who are feeling disappointed already, oh my goodness, you're not going to show any photographs of polar bears. No, I'm not going to. And very happily not going to show you photographs of polar bears in the Antarctic. So, well, that was the reason. And I named this The Last Frontier from my association as a cricket commentator. I was a cricket commentator for All India Radio from 1972 to 2005.
Oh, wow.
And cricket commentator in English. And my first love was cricket commentary. The second love was surgery. Third love was my wife. And I told her that also. She's okay with that. Well, anyway, so Steve Waugh, when he came here in 2001, all of you remember that great series, Rahul Dravid and VVS Lakshman series. Steve Waugh's Australians had conquered everyone, both in Australia as well as in their home countries, in South Africa, in West Indies, in England, and so on. But he had never beaten India in India.
Right.
So he had said that this trip is going to be the last frontier. Of course, he denies having said that, but that's become part of cricket folklore, as it were. So I named this The Last Frontier because I wanted to get rid of that first. Once I crossed that, I thought the other frontiers would be fairly easy. That's the reason for my naming this The Last Frontier. So now I want you to just sit back, relax, enjoy the journey with me as I take you down to Antarctica. Right,
Super.
let's go.
Yeah.
Now that is me. The old, Bangalore International Airport looked like that then in 2013. And now don't look at that lady. She's got nothing to do with me, please. I gave the camera to my driver and said, "Take a photograph." He should have waited a few seconds, but he clicked, and that's the only photograph I have. Now the reason I'm showing you this is just to show you what I carried with me.
Okay.
That big suitcase at the bottom contained all my clothes, including my big boots and so on. Next one contained lots of these electrical equipment for charging, recharging, and all that. The small laptop bag obviously contained the laptop and the hard drives and so on, and my camera bag strapped to my back. So this is all that I carried with me on that 1 month trip, just living out of a suitcase, literally. Right, then this is the way I managed to travel from Bangalore to Dubai, stayed there overnight, caught a very early morning flight from there, and over the next 16 to 18 hours, traveled to Buenos Aires in Brazil, and then to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, to Buenos Aires in Argentina.
Right.
There I stayed again overnight in a very, very quaint little place. And this is a small little hotel, very, very pretty, very small, very clean. And I spent that night in this place. And there you can see me enjoying myself, having breakfast early in the morning. And this photograph is a very, very rare photograph, as Mohan Thomas will tell you. I'm holding a glass of orange juice in my hand. Even my friends keep making fun of me every time I show them this photograph. But anyway, that's the photograph I have, and I have to live with that now. So, well, after spending that, took another flight next day, more than 4 hours, from Buenos Aires, which you can see there on the east east coast of South America, and all the way down to this southernmost city on earth called Ushuaia.
Right.
Ushuaia is the southernmost city, population of about 50,000 people, and mainly tourists, obviously. Nothing much to be done there. It's covered on 3 sides, surrounded on 3 sides by mountains, snow-clad mountains, and then the city. And then on the south side, there is this Drake's Passage, which is probably the most horrendous passage of sea that you can ever get, with very, very high waves, very, very choppy seas,
Right.
all the way to the Antarctic. So this is the small little strip of water that separates Ushuaia from mainland Antarctica. That evening, met up with some friends, and we were going to spend the next 1 month with these friends. The guy sitting opposite me, who's looking to his right, not the bald guy, the other guy with the gray hair looking to his right. I shared the room with him.
Okay.
And when I say room, it was a very, very small room. I'm talking about 6 feet by 8 feet.
Cabin kind of thing.
Yeah, bunk beds. And since I was younger than him, I had to sleep on top, which meant, you roll even more than the guy at the bottom. Not that he's rolling less, but I'm rolling far more than that. Very, very small. It had just one small little wash basin in that room, and then one attached toilet, which was shared with the guys in the other room on the other side. So they then went to the hotel and met the tour operator, this huge polar bear of a guy, Joseph Van Os. And the man standing next to him in that green shirt, full sleeved, is John Shaw, the legendary photographer, a great guru, Photoshop guru. And, people would give an arm and a leg just to spend an hour with him. And I had one whole month with this great man.
Wow.
Very, very nice, very happy to share his knowledge, and extremely friendly. You could approach him any time of the day, or evening, night, whatever time, and he would gladly share his knowledge with all of us. This is a ship that we sailed in. It's called the MV Ushuaia. What else? Ushuaia, so MV Ushuaia. Small little ship, actually, about 240 feet or so in length. It was apparently built in the 1960s as a spy vessel for the United States, because of the Cold War that they were having with Russia at that time, and the Cuban crisis and so on. So this was that ship. Of course, it was retrofitted now, and then it had something like, it could carry about 70 of us, the photographers, and about 20 crew, at the most about 100 people. That's all. Very, very small. It did not have a stabilizer, so you're going to get thrown around all over the place, front and back, and sway around. And it did not have an ice cutter. So the captain had to be very, very careful not to go into areas where there were packs of ice. Otherwise, we would get stuck there. So it wasn't that easy. You can see one orange lifeboat on the side, There were a few lifeboats there. And on the first, this is our bunk bed, like I said, and a small little wash basin, very tiny table and a chair. And there was this connecting door to the toilet. And since there were others living on the other side, you had to make sure before using the toilet that, you lock their door. Otherwise, you don't want them coming in. And you lock your door, obviously. Then you do whatever you want to. But here I'd like to say that it was always better to sit down, and even for peeing, like ladies do. Otherwise, you'll be spraying it all over the place, because it was that choppy. Believe me, very, very choppy. So I'm serious when I said you had to sit down and then do it, because very, very embarrassing for others to come. And before leaving, you had to remember to unlock the other door, not just your door. Otherwise, you lock them out of the toilet. It happened on 2 or 3 occasions, and then they came searching for me all over on the deck. Hey, where are you? Open that. Go back and open the door. So I had to run back in. So you had to remember that as well. And first day we were given these lessons. We were given our life jackets. That life jacket stayed with us at all times. Before getting off the ship, we had to wear it. Before coming back on ship, we had to make sure that we were wearing it when we came back and take it to our rooms. So we're given the lessons on what to do in case there was, an accident, where our lifeboats were. So we were divided into groups, and group 1, 2, 3, 4, and we were given that lifeboat number. That lifeboat would contain some maybe biscuits and stuff like that to last us a few days before we were rescued. So this was not going to be an easy trip at all. It was, it was full of danger, and we were made aware of that and told to be very, very careful. Now, as you can see, this is the only common area that we had.
Okay.
And at the far right of your screen, you will see a small little counter, which is where the coffee and tea and all were. And in the evening, it turned into a bar. All the poles, all these railings, and all the sofas and tables were screwed down to the bottom. They were securely fastened, because the ship would lurch around so much, there would be danger of a person getting killed with the sofa, moving around, and our table hitting you. So everything was fixed down to the floor. And you can see white little tags hanging down from the railings.
Yes.
Those are what are called barf bags, because people were seasick. I took Dramamine, but I had nausea for the first 2 or 3 days in spite of that. But I think more than 80% of people, and these are all Westerners, they didn't even appear on the deck for the first 2 or 3 days. They were all throwing up violently. So there was no time to go to the toilet. You just rip off one sheet, you throw up in that, and then go and dispose of it later. And there was a flight of stairs leading to the top deck and flight of stairs leading to the bottom deck. Top and bottom, of course, there were rooms as well. And bottom deck also had a lovely audiovisual room. So in between, while we were sailing, it was packed with something to do every day. There were talks on Photoshop, talks on composition, talks on metering mode, talks on seals, talks on geology, talks on global warming. And we had so many of these people, talking to us and teaching us, that there was never a dull moment. I mean, it's up to you whether you wanted to go or not, but if you wanted to, there was always something going on at all times. And while climbing up, you had to be very careful. We were told to hold on to the railings, if possible, with both hands. Even though you had your camera, put the camera around your neck and then hold on with both hands, because suddenly the ship would lurch. And the staircase would become vertical, and you would be climbing up as an upper ladder. And the next moment, the ship would go down, and you'll be running. You'll find yourself running, and also from side to side and so on. And there was 2 incidents on previous trips. One where a person fractured his leg, but luckily it was in the beginning of the tour, so he was taken off the ship and flown back to Argentina. On another occasion, a person died, fell down and hit the head and died. And unfortunately, the ship was way out by then, so the body had to be kept on ice and then returned to the relatives only at the end of the trip. So this was definitely not an easy trip. The reason I'm saying it again and again is that this is not going to be an easy trip if you're planning to go anywhere near there. Please be very, very careful about all these things. One person lost a tripod. The tour operator, that big polar bear of a guy I said, Joseph Vanos, he fell on a rock, and then, he fractured a few ribs. So he couldn't laugh or cough or sneeze without severe pain for the rest of the trip. So again, as I said, not easy at all. So this is the condition of the ship, just in brief. And what we did was we sailed from Ushuaia northeast to the Falklands, and from there southeast to South Georgia, and then southwest to mainland Antarctica. That is just the Antarctic Peninsula. The Antarctic is so huge. It's a massive continent by itself. There's no way you can do anything. And then, of course, you don't have wildlife scattered all over the Antarctic, only on the coast. So we went to Antarctic Peninsula and then back again to Ushuaia. Falklands and South Georgia are UK territories. And Argentina went to war against the UK sometime in the 1980s or so.
Yeah.
And Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of UK at that time. She sent warships there, and then they retained control of the Falklands and South Georgia. So at present, they are still UK territories, but still disputed territories because Argentina disputes the ownership. Right, now Falklands consists mainly of West Falkland and East Falklands, but there are more than some 100 or 150 islands there. We went only to 2 or 3 places, but if you're going there, please make sure that you go on a trip which will spend at least 7 to 10 days on the Falklands and at least 7 to 10 days in South Georgia. By themselves, they deserve more than 10 days, maybe even 12 days or 14 days in the Falklands and similar amount in South Georgia. They're magnificent in terms of wildlife, in terms of landscape, the scenery is absolutely stunning. We spent just 2 days in the Falklands because our main trip was going to be South Georgia and the Antarctic.
Right.
Next is South Georgia. It's there's a terrible picture that I got from the net. It's sausage-shaped island, as you can see. And there's a mountain range running from north to south, bisecting the island into an east part and a west part. The east part is where the wildlife is, and it is relatively warmer. I'm talking relatively warm. I'm talking about, -7 and -8 is warm compared to the west side, which is the other side. It's extremely cold. And because of that, the seas are very choppy, not too many animals there. So we just stay on the east side or the north side. And you can see the numbers written there. The reason for that, 7 is in one place, 8 is far away from that, 9 is somewhere else, and so on. Why I've written that is, this is the way the ship traveled. We were supposed, normally you go from 7 to 8 to 9 to 10, but it was going up and down, up and down. The reason for that is, the captain would say that, look, we're going to dock here, and then you can go down and then take photographs. But then we would suddenly find that it is either raining or snowing or the sea is very choppy. You can't make a landing. You can't get off the ship. So the captain says, okay, let's go a little further down. Goes there and turns around a corner again. And then suddenly the sea is very calm. It's not raining, not snowing. You can get down, go in the Zodiacs, make a landing and take your photographs and come back. So that's the reason why the captain had to go, backward and forward, and then cover the entire east coast of South Georgia. It's a much better picture from the internet, and that is the Allardyce Range. That's the mountain range that bisects that island into the east and the west, or the north and the south, if you prefer that. I'll please remember this because I'll come back to this Allardyce Range later in my talk. Right. Then Antarctica, of course, like I said, it's massive continent. It took Captain Cook in the 1700s almost 3 years to circumnavigate the Antarctic. That's how big it is. And the Antarctic is actual land. It's a landmass, unlike the Arctic, which freezes over in winter and then thaws in summer. So you can't have a permanent base in the Arctic. You can have several, and there are several research stations based in the Antarctic. India also has one of them, very close to the Russian one. And it's possible because it's landmass. It is actually a continent, unlike the Arctic, which freezes and then thaws. And you can see how close Ushuaia is to the Antarctic Peninsula to the left of the screen.
Yeah.
And you can also go to the Antarctic from New Zealand or Australia, but that is much, much further away. It would take you 5 days to get there. And that is where the emperor penguins are, mainly.
Okay.
You probably will not find emperor penguins in this part, in the Antarctic Peninsula. There can be some stragglers, but the main colonies are all from New Zealand or Australia.
Awesome.
Here, of course, it was fairly regular. We did 1, 2, 3, 4 all in order, so it wasn't a problem. Now, before getting off, we had to, like I said, wear your life jacket. But before that, an inner wear, your underwear and banian and so on, and then thermal wear, and then your shirt and pants, and then warm clothing, and then your photographer's jacket where you carry all your lenses and your extenders and so on, and the life jacket, and then the tripod in your camera bag. All this has to be taken with you when you go ashore and then bring them back again. You step into one tray of antiseptic solution and a second tray and a third tray before you get off, so that you maintain the cleanliness where you're getting off and then on again. So get down into the zodiac. It looks very, very simple here, where the sea is very still. Sometimes it can be a little choppy.
Mhm.
So suddenly you find yourself, as you're stepping down, suddenly the lifeboat is far away. And then, you find that it's not that close. And then your leg is dangling halfway. And then you have to wait for the zodiac to come back in. And you can't jump, obviously. It's going to break, the sink. So we then were taken by Zodiac, landing. It leaves a few tourists and goes back again to get some more photographers.
Mhm.
And we are all given a lecture on what we can do and what we can't do. They're all told not to get less than 6 meters from any animal or bird.
Mhm.
They are extremely tame. They are not afraid of human beings at all. But you don't take advantage of that and then, alarm them in some way by going too close.
Right.
Of course, the animals and birds have not been given that lesson. So, they come up to you. They're very, very curious. But you're not supposed to go near them. You stay put. If they come, that's okay. But you don't go right into their midst. And it isn't that as soon as you land, you're going to find animals everywhere and birds everywhere. No. You have to trek, carrying all that equipment and all that, clothing. You have to walk and, walk and walk and walk, as you can see here in the Falklands. And you can see the typical Falklands habitat as well. No trees. Absolutely not a single tree will you see on the entire trip.
Oh.
It's all grass, tussock grass as it's called, very, very tough grass. All the birds have to lay their eggs on the ground.
Mhm.
All the animals have to, bring up their babies on the ground as well. There's no question of any trees anywhere. So we had to walk up there, walk down on the other side of that slope, and then far away to the left, you can see colonies of blue-eyed shags, cormorants, and albatrosses. So we had to go all the way there to be able to photograph them. Like I said, animals, these birds are very, very curious. They come up to you. And you can either take photographs, using a tripod,
Mhm.
but it's always better because these creatures are quite small. So you better to go down to their level rather than from up. But, you have a choice of doing all this. And this looks like, when a prime minister or president of another country comes to your country, there's a guard of honor, and then let pass. Look at the way this penguin is walking, inspecting all of us. It reminded me so much of that. Or you can also take photographs from the ship.
Mhm.
Lots of birds keep following the ship because, it disturbs some fish and all that, and those birds can catch the fish. So they're always traveling next to us. So when the ship is going up and down and from side to side, and the birds are also flying, you have to try and then get your focus on the bird and then take photographs. It's very, very slippery, as you can see, even in the photograph, rather wet floor.
Mhm.
And if you by chance slip and fall inside, I don't think it'll take even 30 seconds for a person to die because of the shock of hitting such cold water. So you have to be very, very careful, not too many railings to hold on to. And you can make photographs like this, bird in flight, white against white backgrounds. You have to overexpose. This is the sort of the crow of the Antarctic. It just cleans up everything. So it's a sheathbill, snowy sheathbill. This is a snowy snow petrel or the pintado petrel, 5 feet wingspan across,
Oh.
ventral surface and the dorsal surface. So you have to try and then get your exposure right. It's better to be in manual mode. If you're not, then you have to be quick-witted to be able to, overexpose, underexpose, and so on.
Exposure compensation, basically.
You have to keep doing that all the time. Otherwise, you are in manual mode. I think you're much better that way. This is a kelp gull. And of course, like I said, best is to get down to that level and then shoot from ground level. It's very, very cold, obviously, as you can see. But these penguins are really short, some of them. And when you're shooting, always keep an eye around you because something interesting could be happening behind you. There's this penguin that is tobogganing, which is, sort of sliding down. And something interesting can be happening behind you. So better to keep an eye out. And as I said, you have to trek. These birds, penguins, do not lay their eggs on snow. They lay their eggs on rocky areas. So you have to keep walking until you come to the rocky area. And here you can see, how we have to trek a lot. At the far end, you can see a colony of penguins on that flat area. Yes. So we have to trek all the way there if you want to get photographs of penguins nesting. So again, as I said, not easy. Quite often, it happened to me once where, the leg suddenly went into deep snow and I had to pull my leg out and found that only my leg came out, my boot was still inside. So I had to sort of dive back in again and retrieve my boot and put it back. So yeah, and at the end of the day, you wait for the Zodiacs to come back and take you back. Okay. Now on the Falklands, if you wanted to, ease yourself, you could go around a corner
Mhm.
South Georgia, you were told you cannot, better not to use the toilet. You can't pee outside.
Mhm.
Antarctica, 100% no, you cannot. So if you have to do something, wait for the Zodiac to come. Zodiac will take you back to the ship. You go to the toilet and come back again. So you had to hold on the whole day in those conditions. And because you're, like I said, interested in photography. This is Joseph Van Os, the tour leader,
Mhm.
and all the other people who were our guides there. John Shaw with the blue shirt, and to his left is Wayne Lynch. He is an intensivist who turned into a photographer. He's writing a book on bears, and I've contributed a photograph for his book there. That is Joseph Van Os. Then there is this guy, Chris Edwards, was a genius in geology. So he tell you all about tectonic plate shifts and all that. And in the foreground, in the red shirt, Monica, a German living in Argentina, and she made very sure that we never got anywhere close to the birds within 2 meters.
Mhm.
And Anna was an expert with seals, so there were lots of talks on seals and so on. And Ian and McDonald, they run their own separate tours, but they come together when the Antarctic tour is there. So typical Falklands. Now I'll show you some images now. Falklands, tussock grass. Now there are more sheep on that island than there are people, like in New Zealand, and Falklands even more so. That ratio is even more so.
Mhm.
Normally, 1 acre of grassland will support about 12 to 14 sheep.
Mhm.
But in this, it can only support about 2 sheep. That's how bad in quality, in nutrition, the grass is. In spite of that, Britain wants to hold on to that territory. Of course, it's their concern. So really low in nutrition.
Mhm.
And like I said, you have to walk and walk and walk. Just a short video to show how windy it can be. Albatrosses.
Mhm. Wow, beautiful.
Upland goose, male and female with chicks.
Mhm.
Photographers shooting albatrosses in flight as well as on land. Black-browed albatross, and far away are blue-eyed shags or blue-eyed cormorants. Raining, as you can see.
Yeah.
Bitterly cold. But penguin colonies on where there are rocky areas. All of us look like penguins ourselves.
These landscapes remind me of Faroe Island and Iceland.
Right. Upland goose male. And this is the only photograph I have of this Magellanic penguin. The only penguins that that live in burrows underground. All the others sort of nest on land, but this particular species wants some burrows to lay their eggs and bring up their chicks. Gentoo penguin. And one of the reasons why we are told not to get to within 2 meters is because of this. Your pants will become white if you're not careful. So there's a ring of white around these nests.
Yes.
And there's a striated caracara, a bird of prey, waiting for one of these penguins to get up so that it can take the egg or the chick. Gentoo penguins mating.
Mhm.
Upland goose, a different kind. Male. Upland goose female. This is the ashy crowned goose or ashy-headed goose. Upland goose female, and it was summer, so the lovely flowers around.
Oh, beautiful.
Close up of the upland goose male. Buff-necked ibis.
Mhm.
Striated caracara.
This is the highest on the food chain.
Highest on the food chain there in that place. Of course, in the air.
Okay.
You have killer whales. You have
Oh.
seals. You have seals which hunt penguins.
Right.
Some seals hunt penguins. So in the air, yes. Kelp goose male and the kelp goose female.
Mhm.
Whale bones more than a kilometer inside from the shore. You can imagine the kind of wind speed and the force of the waves that can bring a whale carcass more than a kilometer onto the land.
Wow.
Rock hopper penguin. It's called that because it hops from rock to rock, and they have to go all the way down to the sea catch the fish, hop back up again, upwards, and to go to their nests. So not an easy job being a penguin. And when you're going back, these guys have belly full of fish to take back to their chicks. So they're heavier going up. And they make all these funny little signs, saying, your friend went that way, or no, he went this way. Absolutely. They're fantastic to interact with. Rockhopper penguin doing what it does best. Hop from rock to rock.
That's all.
The American oyster catcher. Black-browed albatross. No, these are very, very beautiful birds. Those 9.5 feet wingspan. Not the biggest of the albatrosses, but very, very pretty. And lend themselves beautifully to black and white. Here again. Courtship. Display going clack, 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 with their beaks.
Oh, yeah. Beautiful portraits. I think, Doc, you mentioned about your camera bag, but for the viewers, can you just tell us what one should carry in the bag in terms of what are the lenses they are the best for this, especially Antarctica?
I carried at that time I had a 1D Mark III. I carried a 500 f4,
okay,
100 400, and wide angle 16-28.
Okay, super.
So that's all. But if I were to go again, I think a 500 is an overkill because they come so close to you. Unless you want to make some interesting, take some interesting images and so on, portraits. A 500 is, like I said, an overkill. 100 400, 70 200, or maybe even a 300 mm f2.8 and a wide angle. That would, I think, be very, very good. Okay. I would say 300, a 70 200, maybe a 1.4 extender.
Okay.
And a wide angle. I think that because nowadays, being so strict, the airlines being so strict about what you can carry with you.
Right.
If you want to go with DSLRs, that is.
Yeah. Sir, one more question from my side. Since you mentioned it about summer, so there is no night there, right?
Yeah, very, very, like sun would set at about, say, 11 o'clock and then up at about, say, 3 a.m. or so.
Okay, so everything would be a blue hour?
Well, almost, yes.
Okay, so any chances of seeing the southern lights?
No, not there at least.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a 9-foot wingspan, dorsal surface, black-browed albatross, ventral surface. And of course, now this is the southern elephant seal. We come to some mammals here. The southern elephant seal, if it were not for the fact that, it mainly does its hunting or only does its hunting in the water and hunts only fish, doesn't hunt penguins, it would have been, but for that, it would have been the second largest land animal.
Oh.
Because it goes into the sea to hunt and then comes ashore only for mating and for resting, it is not regarded as a land animal. But the biggest one recorded was 22 feet in length and over 4,000 kilograms, 4 tons.
Oh my God.
That would make it heavier than any hippopotamus or a rhino or anything. But like I said, it's not a land animal, so it doesn't come under that category. Now, these guys are larger than their cousins, the northern elephant seals, which are found off the coast of California. It's a southern elephant seal. And the male is so huge compared to the female, this probably has the biggest sexual dimorphism of any creature known to man. There's a huge difference in sizes. And these guys are full of fish that they've eaten several days ago, and it's all rotting inside, while they're digesting. So we were told not to get downwind of them because it can really stink. But you get caught unaware sometimes. You're trying to take a photograph and then suddenly it goes, and then you have a big blast on your face. It's terrible. It really stinks. And you can see lots of these marks on the body, bite marks and bleeding. I'll come to that now. This is Mr. Handsome. I mean, for a female, he must be the most handsome-looking character ever. Okay. We might not find him that, but southern elephant seal, another guy, another handsome guy. And there he is with his harem of females. This particular day, the wind speed was about 75 kilometers per hour. That was recorded on the ship. And it was coming down the glacier. It was so cold and it was so windy. All the animals, including the seals and us, we were all flat on the ground. There was no way you could stand because you'd get blown over. Only the guys standing up were the penguins, which you can see in the background there.
Right.
All of them were coming back from their fishing, and they were all walking as if nothing happened. But they were so laden with fish that, the center of gravity was low, so they were all sort of walking around like this, as normally do. But all the other animals were flat, absolutely flat. Again, me getting downwind of another snorting southern elephant seal. And these guys are called beach masters.
Mhm.
They are in charge of that particular part of the beach and all the females that are with them. So there's a constant struggle for new males trying to come there, and there's a constant fight between the guy who's coming in and the guy who's already there as a beach master. So that's the reason for all those bite marks. They're constantly fighting, trying to gain control over the females in that particular territory of the beach. Peculiarity of the southern elephant seal is, like some other creatures, their penises have bones in them.
Oh.
So it's called a baculum. The largest or longest baculum of any creature is found in the walrus. The southern elephant seal apparently is not as big as that, but they have a bony penis, and a number of other creatures have that. Some of these are bony penises. Look at the shape. They look like, ancient warfare weapons.
Yeah.
And all these rakshasas and all that, wielding that in all these mythological movies. They amazing shapes. Other kind of seal you find is the Antarctic fur seal. It's actually sea lion in the sense it's got external ears, but these guys are very, very nasty. They are born with a nasty DNA in their, in their system, and they have this huge area of 25 feet around that diameter around where they guard the territory. All at that time, there were only males who were waiting for the females to come ashore. So we were told to be very careful because they're like landmines.
Oh.
You go near them, they can attack. They've been known to attack, and there have been instances where they have attacked and caused serious injury. They have very sharp teeth and very bad teeth as well in terms of the bacteria that they carry. So it's not a good idea to get bitten by them. So you make your way in between these, keeping an eye out behind you to see that you're not being followed, and you go to where you want to take the photographs. Here it is, Antarctic fur seal, the external ear that is very, very clear. They look very cute, but looks can be very deceptive. Now this pup was probably from the previous year. And even though he's so small, maybe 1/3 or 1/4 the size of the adult, he still has, like I said, that nasty DNA in him. And he's trying to take a big chunk out of the adult's body. Look at that.
Oh.
That's amazing. Again, like I said, they look very, very cute. This day was snowing. Again, only things vertical are the penguins in the background that you can see all the vertical stripes. And this is something nobody will ever see again. And these are, can anybody tell me what this is? Reindeer.
Oh.
Now, reindeer are found only in the northern hemisphere. They do not belong to the southern hemisphere. So where do you get the reindeer from? When the whalers and the sealers, as they were called, the guys who kill seals for blubber, they were called sealers. Not the sailors. The sailors are different. Sealers. They brought these with them so that in the winter months when they couldn't fish, these reindeer would provide them fresh meat.
Oh.
So lots of reindeer when I went there, but the reindeer, they walk around everywhere, and they're big animals and big, tough hooves. And since all the birds have to lay their eggs on the ground, these reindeer would inadvertently, accidentally, sort of smash those eggs. So scientists thought that, these don't belong here, and the bird population can actually increase if we get rid of them. So orders were issued to shoot all of them. By 2015, all the reindeer had been shot. There are no more reindeer to be found in South Georgia.
Okay.
This is the Weddell seal. Weddell seal, again, hunts only fish, doesn't hunt penguins. There's a leopard seal that hunts penguins, but we caught a glimpse of that far away, couldn't take a photograph. They're all quite shy. When you come near them, they sort of jump into the water. But this guy was very, very cooperative, and he gave us lots of poses as we went in our Zodiac all the way around this iceberg. Yoga pose.
Ah, beautiful.
I think Baba Ramdev will be very proud of it. Of course, we saw lots of whales as well. The humpback whale, the grey whale, the right whale, the sperm whale, so lots of whales. And of course, the characteristic of the whale is when it comes up, it sort of blows out, and you get this huge spume of fine spray.
Yeah.
and which is how the whalers used to be able to recognize when the whales came to the surface and then be able to hunt them. So this is something that I always wanted to photograph, water falling off the fluke of the whale. And this is the wandering albatross with the widest or longest wingspan, 11 feet from wingtip to wingtip.
Oh.
Wandering albatross, ventral surface, absolutely beautiful in flight, but when they come to land, they are very, very clumsy, and they need a long runway, like for a plane. They come and then they flop around and they fall and get up. And same thing with takeoff as well. Before they take off, they have to run, and then get that uplift that they're looking for, and then only they can take off. Right. This was a chick, and it was exercising its pectoral muscles to become strong enough to be able to fly. This is a very, very windy day, and I wanted to get that effect, to show the effect of wind, at the same time retain the sharpness on the eye. So even though I had a tripod, I had to put my weight on that tripod as well to keep that lens steady. This is another, the third albatross that we saw, the sooty mantled albatross, light-mantled sooty albatross, never came to land and, just kept flying. These albatrosses fly they don't come to land for more than a year or 2 years. They come only to breed. So the rest of the time they're either flying or they're on the sea. So it's quite rare to see them on land, as it were. It's not that common really. They come, like I said, only to breed. This is a Gentoo penguin, and I'll just show you a few penguins here. Gentoo penguin again renders itself beautifully to black and white.
Black and white, yeah.
Says welcome to Antarctica. Was it a good joke? I think. Rock. Gentoo penguins. And here, like I just took this to show how close they can come to people, right, even though you're supposed to stay away, and how a wide angle helps.
Yeah.
And the best form of locomotion on land is for them tobogganing. When they find a slope, they go down on their bellies and they sort of slide down on their bellies. Of course, they're absolutely fantastic in water. Here's one Gentoo penguin diving.
Ah, beautiful.
One.
Incredible.
And like I said, they all nest, they need rocky areas to nest. And their nest is all built of small little pebbles. And with they arrange the pebbles in a form of a sort of a shallow saucer-like depression, and they lay their eggs in that. And since rocks are very difficult to come by in this icy landscape, each penguin is looking at the other penguin to see, once that other penguin goes away, he'll quickly go and then steal one small little pebble from there and then come and build that. If the other penguin finds out, there's a big fight. They're always constantly, squawking and quarreling, and this is my rock, no, this is your rock, and so on. Icebergs and penguins. They normally eat snow when they want water, but this one is drinking water here, mainly because it's fresh water that has just reached the sea. So it is still not salty, it is fresh water.
Beautiful.
So they have to travel vast distances. They go to the sea, hunt for fish, fill their bellies with fish, walk all that great distance, climb up the slope, climb on the other side of the slope, and then go to their nest to feed the chicks. This guy's missed the boat. And this is this is a luxury. To find grass for them is a real luxury. So if they find this dead clump of grass, they'll take that to line their nests. And this guy in the water seems to be saying, it's not that deep, it's not that cold, come over. And one guy jumps in rather clumsily, and the guy behind says, that's not the way to jump in. I'll show you how. There's that. And that's the reason for the splash. The splash is not made. People ask, how is there a splash before this bird hits the water? No, the other penguin has already landed, and this one is just following close by. Adelie penguin, even smaller than the Gentoo penguins, very, very small. It's a lovely white ring around the eye, bluish white ring. With eggs. There's one egg here. One is white, the other is colored. The white is the fresh one, which is just freshly laid. The brown one is probably about 2 or 3 days old, and therefore discolored and more camouflaged. Rush hour, Adelie penguin style. And as I said, they're always squawking, talking to each other, or fighting or something. Very pretty bird. There's one bringing a pebble and then
Yes.
to make a nest.
So
And you
normally
keep
female
wondering-
look after the normally female look after the nest.
No, both male and female.
Both
Just-
male and female.
Yeah. Both take turns. And here, it's difficult for us to say which is male and female.
Okay.
There are no distinguishing features as such, but the penguins know. I mean, that is the important thing. No, sir, you find an iceberg like this with penguins on top, and you wonder how they got up there.
Mhm.
Were they there before the iceberg broke off, or what was it?
Hmm.
But they actually shoot out of the water. They're like, like a bullet coming out of water.
Oh.
Shoot like that. Now, there is one coming out.
Oh.
Didn't make a landing properly,
Mhm.
and so fell back in again. But they shoot out again like this, and then they land on that.
How high can they jump, doctor?
This must be, about 10 feet or 15 feet. For those guys, it's how many times? 7, 8 times their height.
Mhm.
It's a huge jump. Maybe even more. I can't remember offhand. This is quite big. Okay, gull. I just wanted to
Mhm.
abstract sort of a thing.
So all these birds in flight, Doc, you would have used your 100 400?
I would think so.
Ah.
Looking back, yes, I would think.
Because easy to carry, easy to.
Yeah, exactly. No, and it lends itself to, it's quite versatile.
Mhm.
100 to 400 rather than having one fixed lens.
Yes.
This is the giant petrel. This is the northern giant petrel. This is southern giant petrel. The difference is the northern at the tip of the beak is slightly reddish in color,
Right.
reddish brown. Southern is greenish in color.
Mhm.
A skua, S-K-U-A, skua.
Yeah.
It looks like a crow, but again, another bird of prey.
Yes.
Blue-eyed shag or cormorant mating.
Ah, beautiful.
Another kind of penguin. This is called a macaroni penguin.
Mhm.
And we were not able to make a landing on this because the sea was very, very rough.
Okay.
And this is where one lady lost her tripod. She was trying to hold that and then it fell into the bottom. It's lying there somewhere now. And our tour leader, tried to get off and landed on a rock and fractured a few ribs. This is the
Oh.
spot. Macaroni penguins. And the chin strap penguin. It's called, look at the lovely strap, like a strap, like the old British policemen used to wear, the bobbies as they were called. The chin strap, like this,
Yes.
so, and very, very cute. They look like they're smiling all the time.
Mhm.
Eating snow,
Okay.
which is what they normally do when they want to drink water or
Water.
fresh water. And the final kind, the seventh kind of penguin that I saw there, and this is the king penguin.
Oh.
Very, very colorful. They are the largest there. Of course, emperor penguins are a little taller than them.
Mhm. Beautiful.
Colony, there were 250,000 pairs, breeding pairs here in this
Oh.
particular area. All those brown ones are all the chicks, and they are much fatter than the adults because adults are traveling to and fro, trying to get them food, and the chicks are just standing there and feeding and becoming fat.
Oh my God. Doctor, thank you so much for sharing this beautiful images. So rare.
And like I said, these fellows suddenly they'll be walking, and suddenly one will throw his head up and go sound like that, and then walk away again. It's fantastic to be with them. Here are two, just meet up. One throws his head up, and then they walk away. Not was what they discuss or what they don't discuss, but that's it. Just one of those rare, really lovely days, blue skies and blue water and so on and so on. Feeding its chick. And this one reminded me of, those Wild West, the cowboy movies,
Mhm.
where the sheriff of the town is this, the chap on the right.
Yeah.
He's in charge. He sees to it that there's a fair fight. And these two guys don't like each other. They've got a gun in their hands. They walk some 20 paces and turn around and shoot. And this reminded me so much of that Wild West. Here I wanted to show, how cold and misty it can actually be. So I didn't try using the dehaze filter, nothing.
Right.
This one is molting from a chick to an adult
Oh,
Oh.
interesting.
chick. And it was a mild bit of snow and rain, and it really made for a wonderful picture. Very, very colorful birds.
Very colorful.
And just the neck pattern,
Wow.
southern elephant seals, king penguins, glacier at the back. Antarctic fur seal and king penguins.
Mhm.
Right, now I come to another short part now. That first one was the longest.
Mhm.
And this one was mainly about landscape. So we did two such trips where we got into the zodiac and just photographed icebergs and so on.
Okay.
Obviously, you can't get into a zodiac when the sea is this choppy.
Mhm.
All those black dots that you see are all penguins.
Oh,
No way you can make your way to those penguin colonies.
Oh.
All those black dots are penguins. Here is a glacier, and then on one occasion, an iceberg came and hit our ship. The ship didn't hit the iceberg; it sort of scraped against that, and there was a sound, that prolonged sound, and the captain had to quickly take the ship away from there.
oh, beautiful.
And because you can see the rock, so this is actually a solid landmass. It's not just snow. There's our ship. This was taken obviously from the Zodiac.
Mhm.
And the captain had to be very careful. Some places where it's very, very narrow isthmus. He
Hmm.
has to negotiate between those two. And here's a lovely natural arch that you can
Yeah.
see here. That's the same arch again.
Yeah.
Some days were, like I said, very, very pretty. And because it was summer,
Mhm.
there were some areas where you could see grass.
Right.
This is what is called pack ice. Now, these are not icebergs.
Mhm.
This is frozen seawater.
Okay.
And they are called pack ice because they almost hunt like a pack of wolves. If a ship were to get stuck in that and these surround that ship will just crack up over a period of time. As that pack ice goes on pressing in, it can actually crack and then sink. So it's called pack ice. And if you don't have an icebreaker, you have to make sure, the captain has to make sure that he goes past all of them. And you can't cut your way through.
Beautiful.
Lovely days, like I said. So one of those days, I remember we came back to the ship and then we had a barbecue on the deck. So fantastic. There's a glacier, and then we went fairly close to that, and then we actually saw, oh, there's a ship again. Again, lends itself to this sort of a thing where you can convert partly to color and partly to black and white. I think it makes for a different kind of picture rather than this.
Beautiful.
Sometimes black and white makes it look more
Yeah.
threatening and more scary
Yeah.
rather than something like this, which looks so lovely. Again, penguin colonies far, far away.
Beautiful.
Lots of rocky things like this. And again, in black and white, just a few lines. It's almost like a minimalist sort of a thing, landscape. This is the area where we found those macaroni penguins. Very, very choppy. No way we could make a landing. Some of these birds are Arctic terns. They've come all the way down from the Arctic to the Antarctic.
Oh.
Antarctic terns and Arctic terns. From this picture, I can't say which one is which, but we had Arctic terns there. It can get very lonely, I'm sure, if you're a penguin and all alone.
Wow.
Again, solid rock. And that Chris Edwards was there, the geologist who would tell us, how many billions of years old this rock was compared to the other rock, which is only, 2 billion years old and things like that. Massive, absolutely massive. This is on an immense scale. Again, negotiating carefully between these pack ice. These people are actually standing in the ship. They're not standing on that ship behind that thing. So. And here we saw carving, where the glacier breaks off.
Yes.
It's called carving, like a cow giving birth to a calf. It's CALVING, carving, and it broke off and the iceberg formed right in front of us. I wish I had taken a video at that time, but and then it becomes an iceberg and floats away. Again, those small black dots are penguins on that.
Oh,
And icebergs,
beautiful.
some of them have some fabulous shapes and designs, all made by wind and water and so on. Lovely shapes. Natural caves like this.
Mhm.
This one is like a fortress. Now, this is a tabular iceberg.
Mhm.
Now, the regular iceberg is got a sloping slope, it slopes down.
Right.
And therefore, you can't go very close to them because the ship can hit the iceberg.
Right.
But with these, they've got straight sides,
Mhm.
and the ship can go very, very close to these icebergs. This is a tabular iceberg.
Wow.
And look at these lovely designs. It was snowing, and that's the reason it looks very noisy, but it's
Mhm.
snow.
Those beautiful shades of aquamarine, no? So fab.
Look at it, it's so blue.
Wow.
Just makes you want to go there.
It really gives you goosebumps. I'm getting goosebumps now looking at it, even though I've seen it so many times myself. Wonderful shapes.
Yes.
Another tabular iceberg.
Wow.
This shot through the water.
Doc, you are taking this lot of these abstracts. I'm sure this is with a very big lens, maybe your 500 mm. When you go for the
I
abstracts.
wouldn't think so, because when I went to the Zodiac, I would probably not take the big lens with me.
Oh,
It's
okay.
very difficult. And to change, you can't change. There's not enough space there. So, yeah, 100, 400 would be the one to take. And this one had, again, lovely design on it. And as we went closer, and look at this, as though there's water flowing down here again, lovely wavy pattern, and like a golf ball pattern here.
Wow.
And I asked the chap who was guiding us, I said, can I break off a chunk and then take it back to the ship?
Huh.
Yeah, you can't take it to India. I said, no, I don't take it to India. I want to take it back to the ship. He said, sure. So I took one small chunk and took it back to the ship and kept it outside my door.
Mhm.
It was there for about 3 days, actually, before it actually melted.
Uh-huh.
But every day I would take off a small piece and add it to my single malt scotch, which I had. And I'll tell you, this experience, when it becomes warm, bubbles, the air sort of, just pops. It's like tiny popping sounds, pop, 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 like that. And then I realized the air that is inside the iceberg is air that was trapped inside it 2,000, 3,000 years ago.
Yes.
So I was actually breathing the air that, Jesus Christ breathed, or, Buddha breathed, or whatever. That experience, I tell you, it's difficult to put into words. It was worth the cost of the entire trip just to experience that.
Yeah, and when these icebergs, I mean, they carve,
Yeah,
sound which
yeah,
is
oh, yeah.
like a gunshot.
True, absolutely. It happens more frequently, I would think, in the Arctic, isn't it?
Yes.
I don't know. People, lots of people who go to the Arctic come back with images of that, of carving. Okay, so now the last part, sorry, not the last, the second last part, again, 2-3 minutes. Now, I call this the Auschwitz of Antarctica. Grytviken is one of those small harbors in South Georgia. And I called it the Auschwitz because thousands and thousands of whales and millions of seals were slaughtered for their blubber. Why did we need this blubber? The reason for that was the great industrial revolution began in Britain in around 1760 or so, and then spread to the US and Europe. And for the first time, machines were able to make what humans were making. Humans could make only, for example, one chair at a time. Machines could make maybe hundreds and thousands of tables and chairs at a time, over a period of one day. And they would all be the same, unlike human hands, where there'd be differences between one human and another. So machines replaced humans. There was mass production.
Mhm.
And for that, coal was required, not wood. So coal mines came into being and they came into prominence. And to drive these machines, lubricants were needed. And where were the lubricants? Subterranean oil had not yet been discovered, or if it had been known, it was very difficult to get out and very, very costly. So the easiest way to get lubricants was by killing whales and seals and getting the blubber from them and then making the oil from that. So that is the reason why there were whalers and sealers, and they wiped out the entire population almost of whales and seals in the northern hemisphere.
Okay.
Meanwhile, explorers were going further and further south, totally different from whalers and sealers, like, for example, Captain Cook and so on. And they came back with lovely anecdotes, beautifully written notes in their diaries as to how many millions of whales and seals there were in the southern hemisphere. So suddenly now these industrialists said, oh my goodness, now we're wondering what to do when all the whales and seals ran out. Let's go to the southern hemisphere. So they all came down south. And a number of people came down and established whaling areas. And Grytviken was probably the first whaling station in November 1904 and the last to shut shop in 1966. So they all came there. At the same time, of course, the race to the South Pole was happening at the same time. Now, this is where Grytviken is, that in capital letters, it was a harbor within a harbor. So it was very well protected from the winds and the high seas and so on. So ideal place to bring the ships in and without being disturbed, slaughter the whales and then take the blubber out. There's another place that I want to mention, Stromness, which is north of Grytviken. Just just remember that name, Stromness. Grytviken is what we'll concentrate on. Whaling wasn't an easy job because the only wooden ships at that time. Captains did not trust coal and burning coal and all that on their wooden ships. They did not want machines to be running their ships. So it was only by sailing. And there was this one guy whose job was to sit on this, what is called the crow's nest. It's a small little tub right on top of a long pole in the middle of the ship, small boat. And from there, he had to keep a lookout for whales. When the whale came up, he would say, there she blows. And the captain would turn the ship and then go in that direction. And then they would throw harpoons with their hands. Each time they go on throwing these. And then finally, they'll be able to kill that whale. They had to immediately take that carcass back because if they delayed, that whale would, bloat with the gases inside and then burst, it would explode and the ship would sink. And there are hundreds of ships apparently at the bottom of this area where, because whales bloated and then burst. If you do a YouTube search on bursting whales or exploding whales, you'll be able to see one or two of those instances. So they would actually explode and sink the ship along with that. Of course, later on came these, the steamers and so on. They were able to go faster. They had, now they were able to fill explosives in the harpoon head. The thing was that it's supposed to go and hit the whale and then it explodes and then the whale would die. But quite often the chap who was filling the explosive inside, it would explode there. He would lose his hand or leg or something. And that is the end of it. Because once that happened on the ship in the Antarctic, no question of any hospital and doctor and so on, gangrene would set in and person would die. So the place is littered with, graves of youngsters, 18, 20, 25 years old, boys who had come from the northern hemisphere to earn a livelihood, take back some money with them and become rich and so on. But so it wasn't an easy job to do. This is again from the internet, whale being harpooned and then being dragged back. Here again, larger ships taking number of carcasses back. One of those guys who had to, load the explosive in that harpoon head. And the whale would be brought ashore and then peel like we peel a banana. The skin would be cut like that and then be taken off. And the blubber was underneath that and they would take that blubber and then boil it and then get the oil out of it. There's one chap, very, very risky, standing on a slippery ship, which is moving back and forth on blubber and trying to skin that whale on the ship itself. Like I said, it's littered with graves of youngsters, so many youngsters. On a good day, 30 whales were slaughtered. In Grytviken alone, just imagine, 53,000 plus whales slaughtered, 455,000 tons of oil extracted. Now, no part of the whale was a waste. Every part of the whale would be used, including the bones and so on. And just imagine, they would make pen holders, paper folder and cutters, shoe horns made from whale bone. Can you imagine? If you've ever used Sunlight soap, I'm sure all of us as youngsters, I don't know about, you guys, you are much younger, but when we were younger, we would use Sunlight soap to wash our clothes. Sunlight soap, that oil in that came from whale oil.
Oh.
Yes. And main thing, of course, corsets for these ladies wanted to have very, very slim waists. If you've gone and seen Gone with the Wind, for example, the movie, you'll find how this corset was tied. And make the waist really small and then get that lovely figure of 8 shape. And and it was advertised saying it is actual genuine whale bone. Please come and buy from this shop. But what happened was intense whaling led to drastically reduced number of whales. At the same time, fortunately, subterranean oil was discovered in the Middle East and so on, Venezuela and so on. So that oil was easy to extract, much cheaper. So that oil was available, and therefore whaling died a natural death. Now, these are all my pictures. This is how Grytviken looks now, all abandoned whaling ships. That's the crow's nest right on top, that bucket sort of a thing, a basin, or a barrel sort of a thing right on top.
Right.
Shaft. The crow's nest, as it's called. Now, all these have become part of a museum.
Yeah.
The huge anchors, the harpoons, the cannons from which these harpoons were shot. And of course, to wash away our sins, we need some place of worship also. When you do some ghastly deed like that, whether it's a temple or a mosque or a church or whatever. And all these, these machines that were used to make that oil, all now rusting. The heavy chains that were used to drag the whale carcass up that slope for skinning on top. And like I said, God knows what secrets there are hidden behind this. If that door could talk, although that building, again, all those rusting machines that were required then, and now the whales have started coming back. They were unimaginable in those days for a whale to be seen on land like this. Southern elephant seal, not a whale, sorry, southern elephant seal back here. Killer whales are back, the whales are back in the seas. And that is Shackleton's grave. That's me next to Shackleton's grave. Now I just have the last part now. This is about Shackleton. Why did I mention Shackleton? One of the greatest explorers of our times. Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton, commander of the Victorian Order, Order of the British Empire, fellow of the Royal Geographic Society. But to his men, he was simply called the boss. And why was that? Great man himself. Well, he made 4 trips to the Antarctic. The first one, at that time, as I said, the race to the South Pole also was beginning, and he wanted to be the first to put the British flag, UK flag, at the South Pole. So he made 4 trips. The first was on the Discovery, that was the name of the ship. And he did that with Scott. But the two, Scott and he, didn't get along, so he never made any more trips with Scott. He made the second expedition, the Nimrod expedition, and reached to within 180 kilometers of the South Pole. That was a record in those times. But he had to return because they ran out of supplies. They were living on a ration of 1 biscuit a day when they came back. He finally caught the ship and came back. He was knighted by King Edward. So that Nimrod expedition, as I said, reached within 180 kilometers. Now, Frank Wild was his right-hand man. And he mentions in that diary of his where, he was starving. Wild was starving. He was dying for something to eat, and Shackleton gave him that 1 biscuit that he had saved for himself. So he gave him that. And Wild notes in his diary, all the money that was ever minted would not have bought that biscuit. And the remembrance of that sacrifice will never leave me. So then finally there were only 2 in the race. That is Scott, the man with whom Shackleton went. Scott was still in the race, and Roald Amundsen from Norway was also in the race. These are the only 2 people finally in the race for the South Pole. This is the 2 ways they made their way to the South Pole. Scott from Ross Island, and from the Bay of Wales, Amundsen. One tried to do it with dog sleds. So Amundsen, though, became the first to reach the South Pole. And of course, Scott had no idea that he was there because there was no question of media and so on coverage at that time. So he reached there just about 5 weeks later. And he was shattered when he found that he was not the first. And that is Roald Amundsen with the Norwegian flag there and proudly putting up that flag at the South Pole. But Scott reaches there and look at the faces there. They're absolutely devastated that Amundsen had beaten them. And Scott writes in his diary, until then, that was the dream place that he wanted to go to. That is the one place. And now he notes in that diary, the worst has happened. All the daydreams must go. And great God, this is an awful place. From the the place that he actually wanted to go to, the dream place that he wanted to go to, it had become an awful place. And on the way back, though, he ran into trouble. Scott ran into trouble. They ran into a huge gale, minus 40 degrees centigrade weather. started losing men one after the other. Evans died, then Oates died, and finally they were left just a few kilometers from the shore, but where they could have been picked up, but there was no way of making it back, and all three remaining people died in their tents, and their bodies were discovered later that year during another expedition, and they were all buried just there in that ice, and they made one mound over it, put the flag on top, and that's where they're buried. And now it's found that all those bodies have sort of sunk inside. They're about 50 feet or 60 feet under the ground. And that is part of this Ross ice shelf, which is a glacier that is moving towards the ocean.
Okay.
And it's calculated that at this speed, it will take about 250 years for that glacier to reach the sea and then maybe break off. And then these bodies, entombed in that iceberg will be floating around for God knows how many more years before it finally melts. And so even though Amundsen's expedition went to the South Pole and back again, Scott's adventure is still continuing. That is Scott's resting place. And in his dying message, he had written, "Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood and endurance and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. These rough notes and our dead bodies must tell the tale." That was on March 29. He probably died the same day or the next day, according to historians.
Mhm.
And Shackleton made the third expedition. Now, this is the one that is the most interesting. By that time, South Pole had been discovered. So he wanted to be the first person to cross the Antarctic from one pole to the other pole. No, I mean, from one end to the other end, right through. So he made this on the ship called the Endurance, which lasted between 1914 and 1917. Now he set out on, now here I'm getting some problem in seeing because all our images are there. But anyway, so they departed. You can see the date there on when they departed from Grytviken. Within a few days, December 7th, they ran into pack ice.
Mm-hmm.
Then heavier pack ice and heavier pack ice. And finally, on January 18th, just about a month later, a little more, the Endurance is trapped now. There is pack ice all around.
Oh.
And now the ship is sort of just drifting. There's no way they can sail. It's just drifting in pack ice. And finally, on October 27, 1915, just imagine, almost 10 months later, now that Endurance is crushed. It's going to sink. So he tells all his men, let's get out. They take small wooden boats and they get outside. They watch their ship sink. And now with pulling their boats along and also partly rowing, they reach what is called Elephant Island.
Mm-hmm.
And on Elephant Island, 33 people, he left behind 33 people. And with just 5, he said, I'm going to go back and rescue you guys. You stay here. So those 33 people on April 9th, 1916, just imagine, 1914 it started. 1916 April, they are there now. And they are now resting under overturned boats, taking shelter and feeding on penguins and fish and so on. While Shackleton, with 4 others, rose. I've seen the replica of the boat. It's about 22 feet in length. That's all. It's very, very short. So they rowed across in the height of winter. This is in April 24th to May 10th, 1916.
Mm-hmm.
They rowed through some of the roughest seas and the coldest seas in the world to South Georgia. And they reached the South Shore. They couldn't make a landing for 2 days because the seas were rough. They made a landing. He left behind 3 men on the west side of, I mentioned South Georgia, how it is divided into West and East.
Yes.
Then he and another, they climbed up this mountain range, the Allardyce mountain range that bisects the island. They had not been mapped, so they didn't know how long they had to go, how high they had to climb. They climbed up, went over on the other side, went to Stromness. He begged the Portuguese tugboat. He got it all the way around, rescued his 3 men on the west side, sailed back, went back to Elephant Island, and on August 30th, 1916, coming close to 1.5 years, more than 1.5 years since they set sail, he rescued every one of his 33 men and went back.
Amazing story.
So he couldn't do what he wanted to do. So he said, finally, I'm going to go once again. So this time he found Rowett to finance him. This is a Shackleton-Rowett expedition.
Mm-hmm.
They went on the ship called the Quest. And most of the crew members, they signed up after having been through that, horrible experience, harrowing experience. They signed up because they had that kind of courage in this man, that he would rescue them no matter what.
Mm.
So they signed up, but he had a heart attack on arrival in Rio. refused treatment, and within a day of arriving in South Georgia, he died. So they radioed Lady Shackleton. She said, no, his heart belongs there. Let him be buried there. So he's buried in his beloved South Georgia. That's the great man's statue in the Royal Geographic Society. And Sir Raymond Priestley summed up his life. He was incomparable in adversity. He was a miracle worker who could save your life against all the odds and long after your number was up. The greatest leader that ever came on God's earth, bar none. So that is the grave of Shackleton. And there we have a small little ritual. All of us gather around. We are all given small short glasses of Captain Morgan rum. I still remember. I'm not a rum drinker, but I still remember that brand. And we all sort of drink a little bit, and with a few drops, we sort of pour it over the grave. And that's the ritual that every party that goes there does. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you all very much for this patient hearing. I don't know how long I've taken. I've taken 1.5 hours, have I? Oh, no, sorry, 1 hour, 15 minutes, something like that. Okay.
That's okay, but Doc, I'll tell you, this is something amazing. I literally virtually had a tour to Antarctica.
So, Doctor, it was an amazing tour through Antarctica. I didn't get a chance to see Antarctica, but you have taken us through the entire Antarctic. It was an amazing experience. Thank you so much for your presentation, and we loved having you on this show.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So
once again, I want to leave you with is now photography tours to the Antarctic. These small photography tours are banned. I don't know whether they'll start again, but at present you can't go to the Antarctic mainland at all. You can go only in these huge 1,000 people or 2,000 people. You can't make a landing there, but you can definitely go to Falklands and South Georgia, and I would say take off, even if it is a 20-25 day tour, 10 days in Falklands, 10 days in South Georgia, really worth your time. And it's an experience of a lifetime. These two places, outstanding.
And what is the best month according to you, Doc?
November to Jan end. November, December, Jan.
November, December, Jan.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And your tour operator will let you know which time is best for, let's say, chicks of a particular species or chicks of another species and so on. So if you don't find, like we did not find any Antarctic fur seal babies, pups, but we were able to see the other creatures. So it all depends on which particular month.
Right. Super. So with this, guys, again, I want to say thanks to Dr. Ajit for taking us through the journey on Antarctica. It was a brilliant. Today, I have a feeling. I mean, मैं बोल सकता है कि मैं खुद वहाँ पे गया था. Okay, that's my virtual tour. Thank you, Doc, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mohan sir. So see you next.
Thank you so much, sir.